again, the Taoist thought is, how do we remove as much of the blinders or the filters from our eyes so that we can see more clearly what is, so that we can make better decisions about this idea of, balance and harmony with how things actually work, and seeing the consequences of what happens when we try to work outside of those natural processes. Welcome to Kinship Cafe. I am your host, Jim Jones. I'm so glad you joined us today. Today, we're going to be working on chapter 9 of the Daodejing. And let me get my screen sharing here. All right. Are you guys seeing my screen okay?
Yes.
Yeah.
Perfect. All right. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm just going to read through this first, and then we'll kind of go back and talk through it. Maybe we'll talk a little on the way too. So first line is, better to stop short than fill to the brim. Over sharpen the blade, and the edge will soon blunt. Amass a storage of gold and jade, and no one can protect it. Claim wealth and titles, and disaster will follow. Retire when the work is done. This is the way of heaven. Now, this time I used the Feng and English translation as opposed to our normal Addiss and Lombardo. This one I thought just kind of captured the ideas a little bit better for what I was finding as I was doing my research on here. I'm going to just back up here to the first half of the chapter and just see what kind of thoughts or how do you, what do you think he's trying to say here with this opening couple of lines?
I think for me, it's like, don't be too much of a tryhard. I don't know. It's a very simple way of putting it, but like, don't overdo it, I guess.
Mm-hmm. So if we take like his first,
if you think about filling a cup of water and then you fill it to the brim, and now you have to go walk to a table with it. This is like a metaphor, but you're going to have a really hard time getting to where you need to go because you're going to spill the water.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Yeah, it has some.
Oh, go ahead.
It has some elements of, greed. Greed becoming the negative side of things. If you just try to pour too much into the cup, if you just try to make the blade too sharp, or if you just try to get tons of riches, you're being greedy. and these are the consequences.
Yeah. So we definitely have stuff about, overdoing and about maybe greed. So what do you think might be some of the motivations for why somebody would try to fill to the brim, or sharpen and sharpen and sharpen, or store as much gold and jade as they could?
Well,
Because
like protection, or go ahead, Taylor.
Oh yeah, go ahead. Oh, I was just gonna say, like, because maybe they don't understand how much they really need, so they just keep going, or they're just attached to these things without understanding, like, that they don't need this much. They just need what they need to live, really. And so they just keep obtaining it because they think for some reason that more is better without a limit.
Mm-hmm. Do you have some thoughts, Toinette?
Yeah, my first impression was just like, overcompensation, saying that, if I'm mainly focusing on the golden jade part, where you're just like over amassing things and, just like going as far as you can because you think that will, like, say you sharpen a blade to a point and you never want it to go dull, then, but actually what you're doing is just blunting it well before it's time.
Mm.
So it's like rushing. It's kind of a feeling of rushing to get this to perfection or something like that.
Yeah.
It makes
So
me think of that study they did for salary, where like up to 70K, that's when people are most happy. Like if they're getting 70K at least, but anything above that doesn't contribute anymore to their happiness. It's just extra.
this is assuming they don't live in California.
Right.
Really expensive.
Right.
Yeah, no, definitely.
Yeah, there was a little asterisk at the bottom of the study. They said, don't listen to this if you live in California.
So if we look at these lines and I introduce the thought about fear, how do you think that impacts how you're looking at these?
The fear of not having enough, or the fear of like losing it? Like if you have more and more and more, then the chance of losing it becomes, well, I guess it doesn't become less, but I don't know, it on the surface it seems to become less, even if reality doesn't actually. The chance of losing it doesn't actually become less when you have more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's kind of if we think about motivation for why is somebody trying to overfill, over sharpen, over store, this could be a motivation that they're concerned about the future, right? That there's a fear that if I don't get enough right now, I might be short later, or I don't know what the future is going to bring, so I'm trying to prepare for that, right? This is a kind of an interesting concept that we'll explore a little bit more, I think, that has to do with and sometimes they'll talk about it as like a scarcity mindset, where there's this limited amount and we've got to make sure we get what we need because we don't know what's going to happen. And then there's another mindset that's a little bit more of an abundance mindset, that there's always more to be had, or there's more that's happening. And I think there's kind of maybe a mix between these two. We can when we start to talk about this idea of enoughness, maybe we'll kind of see some different thoughts on that. But yeah, there's definitely this idea here of all the things that you guys are bringing out, that there's this, overdoing, there's this potentially like trying to hoard for other reasons. But it seems like the consequence of this, like Taylor, you brought up, if you fill up the glass too full, it's hard to keep it in there, right? Or you can't move it around, or maybe even it's hard to get to your mouth to drink it, right? So why are we doing that? It kind of it works in reverse of what we're trying to do. And Dwayne, you brought up, you keep sharpening and sharpening, but you end up kind of dulling it sooner, or blunting it sooner than it would normally. And right here in the text, it's also talking about the problem of, store and store, but then you run into a problem of, how do you protect this? How do you secure it? And that becomes kind of an ongoing battle just to maintain it. And then on the second half, well, really, I would say probably this first line still ties in with those first lines, but I just ran out of room. But this idea of claim wealth and titles and disaster will follow is definitely, tied in with the same kind of warnings that you had with the previous lines. So maybe before we hit that last line, we'll kind of get your thoughts on, what do you think he's trying to get at when he says claim wealth and titles and disaster will follow?
It's kind of bringing me back to one of the other chapters that was talking about titles and authority and stuff like that. And talking about how having a higher hierarchy of people and titles and stuff like that is cause for chaos, really.
Mm. You have any thoughts, Twain?
I mean, it appears as another form of protection or you know, working against fear is to, gather money or gather titles so you have so you become an authority, which is a way of saying, you know, I know better than you. So, um, which is another way to say, oh, I have the authority, so I don't have to fear the future because I have control of it. But
Mm.
then obviously if you have a plan, there's no guarantee it's going to work. Like it could easily just um, fall apart.
Yeah. I like the concept you brought in of control. I think that's an important thing we'll need to think about as we're going through this too, is the struggle to try and control things, right?
Mhm.
And definitely the wealth is tying in with the previous idea about trying to store up too much stuff and how you're going to protect it. Titles, then kind of go along with that as well, in the sense of you know and I'm thinking kind of like you were thinking, Taylor, of going back. There's this one about like, if you don't claim credit, you can't lose it, right? So here we've kind of got this idea claiming the title that, here I am. Maybe we look at it in a modern sense of like, somebody's claiming the heavyweight champion title or whatever. But then you're just kind of set yourself up for somebody to come and try and take it, right? To knock you down and have it for themselves. Then you're constantly this movement then to how do we protect and keep these things, or the status or this level that we've achieved becomes a lot more, that takes up a lot more of our time, right? Of, okay, how do we keep the salary coming in? How do we keep from losing the title or losing the job? How do I keep from, things changing and, some kind of disaster? But yet going down that road, they're suggesting, is what's actually going to bring about the disaster, because ultimately you can't protect it, might be kind of where they're trying to, or what they're suggesting with this chapter. So the response they're saying here is basically, when you do something, get it to the point where, it's what it needs to be, and then step away, retire, let it be, let things kind of go the way they're supposed to go. And then he says, this is the way of heaven. Now, again, way here is the word Tao, but it's a little bit different. It's not trying to get at that level of Tao like they're talking about in general within Taoism, but more along the lines of how we would use it as way here. And in particular, is the way of heaven. So if we think about their constant reference back to nature to understand how things are supposed to work, they would say, well, if we look at the natural world, it tends to be one where, what's needed is what's done, and it's not overdone, right? So the lion might go out and kill the antelope, but it doesn't kill a whole bunch of them because it's trying to store up for the future. It just kind of kills the one that it needs. Or, you could probably look at any number of different types of examples. Could be interesting to look at, maybe they didn't have squirrels that, hide away nuts where they lived. I don't know. But it seems like they kind of like store up things, and ants are kind of known for storing up things as well. So there is this idea of, preparation for the future that we can still see in nature. But I think maybe, again, it gets to the point of, well, how much do you actually need for that? And so even though the ants are storing up and the squirrels are storing up, are they storing up more than they need? I don't know. I haven't studied them enough. But I think the general point is, in nature, you don't see excess. And I think with a lot of these things, we have to take them as generalities as well. So there's definitely kind of a way of speaking in aphorisms here that, if we take a modern example, excuse me, of saying something like, when it rains, it pours. There's a time and place when we say that because it makes sense, because it's, either, we talk about feast or famine and different ways that we kind of structure things. We don't mean that every single time it rains, it's always a downpour, right? It's just a way of talking about a particular situation that, it seems like we're waiting and waiting, and then all of a sudden we get more than we can handle, is what we're trying to express with that. And I think when they make something like these references to nature, we probably need to take some of that into consideration as well. It's not to say that you couldn't find maybe an outlier or something that's maybe a little bit different than what they're saying, but in general, the concept is what they're trying to get across. So if we think then about some of the key points, one of them is definitely this idea of enoughness, which is kind of a funny word, but it's,
I like that word.
What is enough? This is the trick, right? So if we think about, that scarcity mindset versus the abundant mindset, the scarcity is saying, well, you can never have enough because, there's always some kind of disaster. There's always something that could happen. There's always, you don't know, right? It's definitely much more of this kind of fear mindset about the future and about what's needed, and about being able to provide and have what you need to survive. But it ends up becoming something that is amassing usually much more than you need, and maybe things that you don't even need, that make life then more complicated because you've got to deal with all this stuff now, right? My wife was for a while watching these shows about hoarders and how they had to go and clean out their houses and stuff. And it's disturbing to see, but you can see how the way our world is structured, where it's constantly bombarding us with this idea of fear, that this idea of not having enough, or I might need this someday and I shouldn't let go of it, how that could kind of come into play. I remember my grandma, she used to, back when we were younger, newspapers would be delivered and they'd be tied with a string, and to keep them in a roll. And she would keep those strings because you never knew when you were going to need that string for something. And, she grew up and went through the Depression and had this idea of, scarcity because of that event that really grained a lot of things into her. I would definitely not say that she was a hoarder, but it was something that today, I think I need to hold on to this string because I might need it at some point. Well, no, but I didn't go through something like that either. So there's always kind of this balance. Okay, yes, there is this idea of abundance. And if what we're witnessing in the Daodejing is this preservation of, or this representing of, more of a Paleolithic perspective of reality, where there's this marvel at the generativeness of nature, that it continues to produce and it produces what you need. There's something to that too, right? And how did we end up with something like the Depression, which now, as I think about it, I'm not sure about my timing of history because my early American history isn't so awesome, but there's also this Dust Bowl that happens. Does anybody remember if that happens prior to or after the Depression?
I think it was around the same time.
In my mind, I was thinking that one might have precipitated the other, in the sense that we can see this human attempt at control in terms of, we think about farming practices. And one of the results of like this great Dust Bowl problem was that the topsoil had become so depleted, it just basically was able to blow away because it wasn't, full of the same kind of life and nutrients that it used to have, that allowed it to kind of grow and stick together and become healthy, or to be healthy. And that by depleting it through these monocrop agricultural practices, we kind of destroyed a lot of the topsoil, and it created a big problem in terms of food, which I'm assuming that the crop prices and all of that may have precipitated what happened with the crash of the market that happened with the Great Depression. Don't quote me on that, because
I'm looking at the timeline now.
Oh, good.
So it's 1929 is the Great Depression, and then 1931 is the beginning of the Dust Bowl.
Okay, so the Depression preceded the Dust Bowl then. So maybe the connection wasn't quite there in the same way, but I think both of them, even if they weren't directly causing each other, you still have the issue of, this idea of trying to control, and potentially this idea of greed in terms of what may have caused issues with how the stock market issue happens. And we can see that at various points in our history in terms of the economic cycles that we go through. One of the more recent ones where we had the big housing crisis back in, was that 2008? Definitely got into some predatory lending practices where they were, encouraging loans for people who couldn't afford them and whatnot. So there's activity that happens when we're concerned about fears about the future that encourage types of human behavior that is more of a hoarding or a collecting or a storing, and definitely a movement towards trying to control in terms of things like economics or food production or protection from enemies. Definitely we see a lot of our resources going towards things like national security and so forth. So those types of activities are all driven by that scarcity mindset, that question about enoughness that is ultimately rooted in more kind of a fear of the future and what it might bring, that we can contrast with this idea of, more of the abundance mindset where, there's this marveling again at the generative process of nature, and that if we figure out how to work in harmony with that, then we can be in a situation where we don't have that same concerns about the future because we're working in conjunction with these cycles that bring about the things that we need. I'm sure points could be argued on both sides here where, yeah, there are oversimplifications on both sides, but I think they kind of create maybe the yin yang kind of concept that's happening here within Taoism, where it's saying there's elements of control that we need, because if everything is new, if everything is more kind of chaos, that's problematic. And when things are overly controlled, then that becomes problematic because they become brittle and they break. So there's kind of like this mix between the two that you need, and they're kind of reasserting more of this the feminine aspect, which is about that newness, that generative aspect, that bringing back that idea that there is abundance, I think is a lot of what's trying to be addressed here. But also key is that this movement to try and collect and store and hoard and control is what brings about its opposite, right? And this is another key thing within Taoist thought kind of in general, is this idea of reversals. So if things swing too far to one side, we're going to see that they actually go back the other direction. That over time, there's this constant reversal, this constant change. If we think again about that yin-yang image, they're both going into each other. It's not a constant where it's always one thing or the other. It's a swirling change. And so here, the idea is if things are swinging too far one way in terms of amassing and storing and trying to protect, that it's going to invite the opposite to actually happen. And so where the Taoists are like, yes, we need to kind of have this both, it's how do we find that balance? How do we find that harmony? Again, one of the terms we've talked about in the past is this idea of the center, or sometimes it's translated as the mean in terms of, more like a statistical mean. How do we find that spot? How do we find that center to kind of hold on to so we're not going to these extremes? If it's too hard to hold and maintain a cup that's overfilled, then don't overfill it. Figure out that kind of sweet spot, where you can, okay, this makes sense. Now I can actually use the cup the way it's intended. With the knife, it's got a job that we're trying to do. So figure out how to sharpen it enough to make sure you're doing that job, but don't overdo it, because you're going to end up ruining the knife. Same thing about the wealth. How much do you need? Find that balance. Not easy, right? So it's easy to say, yes, there's that center, there's that mean that we're trying to achieve, that harmony and that balance. Every situation is always going to be unique. There's not like a hard and fast rule that every person does exactly this and everything's going to work out. You still have to kind of observe what that is for you in your context to be able to find that out. And that will change over time. Again, nothing is static. So it's an ongoing process. Again, the Taoist thought is, how do we remove as much of the blinders or the filters from our eyes so that we can see more clearly what is, so that we can make better decisions about this idea of, balance and harmony with how things actually work, and seeing the consequences of what happens when we try to work outside of those natural processes. And then this is, where we kind of get into that control. We don't like change. It's just not something that humans are good with. So a lot of this then is trying to hold on to and protect things that are at a certain point. And that just isn't going to work, because things constantly change and there's constantly reversals and all this kind of stuff. So we have to figure out, how do we adjust our mindset to be more comfortable with this idea of change? Book that I really have appreciated in the past, I think I might have mentioned it before, from Alan Watts. It's called The Wisdom of Insecurity. And it's just a brilliant reflection on this idea. We try to have this security, this stableness, this certainty. And all these things are about, how do we control it? How do we keep it so that we know what it is and it doesn't change, and we know what to do? Not part of reality. I know as a software engineer, sometimes I think, why can't we just pick a language and stop changing it and just work with it, and use it and use it and use it? But no, that doesn't work. It's constantly changing. It's constantly evolving. And you have to reinvent yourself every so often to learn a new language, or figure out what the changes are that have rolled out and how the new devices are working that use the software. It's never fixed. It's continuing to change. And if you desire it not to change, here's where that working against harmony is going to come into place. If you try to put in these constraints and box it in and say, nope, we're going to stick with this version of the software and we're not ever going to change it, and we're going to own it and master it and become, the rulers, well, everything else is going to pass you by, and you might be the master of, version 1.0, but, the rest of the world's on version 10. And you're going to be obsolete. So you have to adapt. You have to change. It can't be something where we can, the attempt to control and box things in never is successful. And this is kind of at the core where it's trying to get to, is trying to understand not only how we work with change, recognizing that change is part of the process, but there's this idea of sufficient, and this is kind of like the enoughness, and it's suggesting that this is the way of heaven. Or, they're looking at, the seasons, and when they look up at the heavens, they're thinking of like the stars and the planets, and even the weather with the clouds and the sun and the moon, and how they all go through these processes, and they all go through these change. It's not always day, it's not always night, it's not always winter, it's not always summer. And there's always this ongoing cycle, this change that continues to happen, that brings about all the stuff that makes life possible. How do we kind of plug into that? Well, part of it, they say, is stop trying to control it and make it stay the same all the time. Get used to the idea of that change, that flow, and find out how to jump into and be a part of that flow, and things will be much better for you. And certainly one of the key things they're bringing up in this chapter is this idea of enoughness, or having more of an abundance view as opposed to a scarcity view. So that's kind of my reflections on this. What do you guys have any additional thoughts?
Yeah, I'm hearing just a lot of like find balance. There's a balance in everything. And if you overdo it, it's just really a matter of diminishing returns.
Mm.
And it might take a few trial and errors to find it, but it'll be worth it.
Yeah, I
Well,
agree with Taylor.
oh,
Lots of lots of balance either way to say. I mean, the key is like you're never going to be perfect at balance. It's always you're going too far to the left or you're going too far to the right. So you need to adjust. And it's an ongoing process. It's not something you just say, I'm balanced and everything will work out perfectly, right? Like, so it's because
Like
so
Michael
many,
Scott, I
yeah.
declare bankruptcy.
I guess I don't know that reference.
It's The Office.
Oh,
I haven't
well,
watched it either.
He's kind of a little loopy and he doesn't
Okay.
understand declaring bankruptcy, so he just yells like he's
Oh.
declaring it.
nice. Well, it does bring in an
I
interesting
declare balance.
I declare balance. It's interesting that you bring up the business side of it too, because this is, I think, an area that's very we see this kind of in the extreme, right? Because there's a lot of stuff that we'll talk about how, especially currently, I see lots of business books that are like, how do we deal with this idea of chaos? And there's a military term, VUCA. I don't remember exactly what all the terms are, but it's like a volatile, uncertain, chaotic, and I forget what the A stands for. But all these things are like the landscape that you have to exist in when you're talking about business. And so what are all the efforts go towards, right? They're towards how do we plan? how do we manage things in such a way that we minimize chaos so that we can achieve our goals? And so much of it is around trying to rein in the unknowns and make it more known, to have more certainty, so we can do better projections on how we're trying to, make goals for our business and that kind of thing, which makes sense the way business works and the way our economic system works. But so often it's not the case. And, doing software projects, you see that all the time, especially when you're creating new software, is something always pops up that's unexpected. And so how did they start to wrestle with this? Well, you started to have, Scrum and then Agile, that were different ways to try and address this, where you didn't plan too far because it's going to change. You look down the road to see what you think you want as the overall goal, and you get kind of a direction and orientation, but then you take it in smaller chunks so that you can adjust and be flexible to the changing circumstances. And there's a lot that can be said for that kind of an approach, but it becomes, again, a lot more trickier for businesses that are trying to manage their bottom line and plan how they're doing what they're doing. But we see this struggle with a economic and a business model that operate as though things can be controlled and a world that consistently tells us no, it can't. So we run into this problem all the time, where it's fighting against that reality. And I no idea what the solution for this is. It would be very interesting to see if there were ways for businesses to just give up on the trying to control things and have more of that. How do we work with the changing circumstances more? I know you couldn't do it completely, but it would be curious to see what would that look like. Another interesting business model, I don't know if you've come across, drawing a blank on the name of it now. Give me just a second. Had the book behind me here. I don't know if you've heard of this, called Holacracy. And it is a very interesting kind of an approach to how you would even structure a business, where instead of like this real rigid top-down hierarchy and strict controls and management, every kind of unit, and you'd have to figure out how big that unit would be, is almost kind of self-contained. There's an overall mission statement and purpose of the corporation, but then each of the divisions or units within the divisions are kind of autonomous, and they make their own decisions as long as they're staying in line with what is the overall mission and goal of the company. And one of the things that was kind of stuck out in my mind at the beginning of that is he was talking about a conversation he had with, I think it was the owner of Zappos that makes shoes, I believe. He was asking the question, the owner of Zappos, why is it that corporations are not like cities? If you have a city that goes from being small to being bigger, it ends up being more productive and more activity and more resources are created. Whereas with a corporation, as it grows, it tends to be less productive because there's more overhead. What's different between the city and, this idea of a corporation? And this is where the creator of the holacracy was adjusting the way that looks, so that if you think about a city, there's basic guidelines, but then people start their own business and they do their thing and they try to make it work as best they can within the guidelines of what the city's limits are. And that allows for that autonomy to be more flexible and create what they do. So it's a very interesting approach to trying to think about how do we deal with the fact that reality is not certain, that it is not predictable, that there's always going to be the chaos. We can't tame, we can't box in or eliminate the chaos monster. We have to figure out how to live with it. And what would be some ways we can think personally how we have to adapt to, change in life. But there's, I think, a lot of room for how we could think about that from an economic and from a business perspective as well. I don't know if you guys have any thoughts on that.
No, but it is interesting to compare cities to corporations to see why. The thing is, like, city officials, as they go up, don't necessarily get paid as much as someone that is. Yeah.
Yeah.
But then, like, corporations, the farther you go up in management, the more you get paid. So, like, there's more. The overhead costs more there.
Yeah, there's certainly that, but I expect it has a lot to do with adaptability. And they'll talk about, like, small companies are more agile, they're more able to adjust because they don't have as much bureaucracy, right? And so I think it has more to do with the structure of how do they try to control and manage, as opposed to creating a context that allows for more autonomy and of the individual units, right? And you could potentially have, this is kind of the idea of holacracy, and I don't really even know how successful this is as a business model either. So I'm not saying that this is the way things should go, but it's a curious thought in my mind, because if you give that autonomy to these smaller units, then they're able to act essentially like small companies that can adapt and do things according to changing circumstances. And if they didn't have to get that whole approval through this long chain of control and making sure everything was done in the same way, but still within the overall arching, mission, vision, purpose of the company, then maybe that would be an interesting way that they could accomplish things and get things done. But that could create more of an issue in terms of how do you report on things? How do you do, again, I don't have all the answers for it, but I know, like, from a personal perspective, it would be disaster if I tried to run my life like a corporation. Because the structure of that, the strictness of it, I could never deal with all the crazy shit, all the crazy stuff that pops up all the time. And, I have to be willing to change my plans, to be flexible, to, not get myself in trouble because the plan didn't work out, because I had to deal with the fact that, my kid got in an accident or something, whatever. You just don't know what's going to pop up. And that same kind of flexibility is much harder to pull off in a corporation. So how do those merge together? I don't know.
To me, what stands out is like the process of decision making. Like in the city, the people are voting, right? And they're making decisions on who gets to be in office and what kind of bills get passed and stuff like that. And there's a process in place that's been in place for decision making for a very long time. So while the decisions that are being made change, the process for making those decisions is very well known and stays the same. And so it makes it, there's not as much of a bottleneck, I guess, for making decisions or getting approvals and things like that, because it's all done through voting, and there's a clear flow that goes along with that. Whereas in a company, like, people are changing roles whenever, with the voting system, there's obviously a set number of years that you can expect one person to be in office, whereas like you might have a different boss once a year. Where I came from at SNU, we were being moved around all the time, so we had a different boss all the time, and it would make decision making really difficult because it was constantly changing, and all of our processes were constantly changing with that, because each manager wanted something different. So
Yeah.
I think there's just a lot of things in place that make it flow a lot better within.
Well, and you want to make sure you're thinking too beyond just how the city government works, right? So the city government might be elected and all of that, but what we're thinking about is all the businesses in the city, right?
Mhm.
How does the collection of all these businesses within the context of the city continue to rise and be more productive? And part of it is the distinction between the city government and the individual businesses. And there's definitely a framework they have to operate within, but then there's a lot of autonomy where they can kind of achieve whatever they want to do as long as they're trying to stay within these same goals. Yeah. It's a lot of, I think the future will be interesting to see how these things unfold, especially as, the whole economic market is going to shift more and more as things become more automated, and we're going to have less of a need for people to actually do work. And so I think we're going to go through shifts in terms of like, how do we think about the value of humans, whereas right now a lot of it has to do with their ability to produce. Well, if we don't actually need humans to produce, I think we're gonna have to go through some fundamental shifts in how we think about the value of people, and how we even structure society around that too. It's going to be some interesting times ahead, and hopefully something like these Taoist concepts actually, I think, can help us to weather a lot of those changes in terms of, that flow, and trying to be more clearly seeing what is there so that we can find ways to try and move into more of that natural, harmonious way of working with what is and how things actually are versus what we want them to be or what we're trying to control. Yeah. Well, maybe this is a good place for us to pause then. Kind of an interesting rabbit trail there. It's always fun. So I want to thank you for joining us. If those that are watching this as video would like to join us, you can go to www.kinship.cafe, where you can register for the email, and you'll get invites to be able to come to our live Friday morning Zoom conversations. All right. Take care, everybody.